Welcome to my next Redwall book review. Today we are discussing The Long Patrol. This is the 10th book in the series, and as much as I've been impressed with how I've been able to still love these books as an adult, at book 10, even if the quality is staying roughly the same, I have to admit I am beginning to feel some fatigue. I know a lot of people really like this one, so I might have had more enthusiasm had I not read it in a context where I, in the relative short term, read the 9 books in the same series previous to it. That said, one thing I've been impressed with in my experience of rereading the Redwall books is how many times would I've noticed something wrong with a book and I'm thinking, okay, well, this is a children's series. That's a limit to the series. Brian Jacques, time and time again, impresses me by seemingly picking up on the same problem and correcting it in the next book. So I remember way back when I was reading book 3, Madame Mayo, I was starting to feel like the series was getting repetitive and the characters lacked personality. And then lo and behold, I noticed a quality increase in the writing when it came to Mariel of Redwall. The characters seemed more nuanced, more details. The description seemed richer. I had a similar experience when I was frustrated with The Bellmaker, ironically the sequel to Mariel of Redwall, where I felt like the book just had way too many characters, and Brian Jacques was once again letting his obsession with bringing as many characters, as many species into his book as possible, get in the way of good character development. But then lo and behold, the next book, Outcast of Redwall, stood out for how much he focused on the stories of a couple main characters. So it really feels like Brian Jacques was a really self-aware writer. He was always asking, what was wrong with my last book in the series? And even though all these books are broadly similar, you can see little bits of growth like that. So interestingly, one of my criticisms of book 9, Pearls of Lutra, is that once again, it had a hare in that book, and it was starting to feel kind of silly that there were all these new hares in the series, but the joke with them was always the same. They always had the exact same personality. They were in the military, but they were lighthearted and they liked to eat. And it kind of felt kind of frustrating that Brian Jacques was, pretending these were all different characters rather than finding ways to, develop one character. And I know that's a problem created because every book is set in a generation, but at least rather than having Basil and Klecky and pretending Klecky is so special and different than Basil, at least make him Basil Jr. or something. Long Patrol, I felt like, tried to address that problem of all the hares feeling the same because it's the first book centered around hares. It is the first book in which a hare is the protagonist. And we have a number of scenes where most of the other characters are hares too. So I started this book and thought, amazing. Once again, Brian Jacques saw a problem with how his series was going and course corrected. The start of this book is absolutely wonderful. We're introduced to a young hare named Tammo, and like all hares in the series, he has a ridiculous long name. Most of the characters only have a first name, whereas hares, I guess because they're modeled after certain British elite, have these long fancy names. So Tammo the hare's full name is Tamello de Formello Tussock. But anyway, Tammo wants to join this legendary hare army that we've heard about in other books called the Long Patrol. But his father, Colonel Cornsbury, opposes it. So through Tammo and Cornsbury, Brian Jacques kind of builds on this idea that even though I know I just said there's only one kind of hare in the series, there's sort of 2 types of hares. Namely, you have the fun-loving militaristic types like Basil and Klecky and On Rosie, but you have also those who are on a slightly different place in the spectrum and that their militarism makes them a bit stuffy. I'm particularly thinking of the character Meldrum from The Bellmaker. So the beginning of this book sets up a conflict between these 2 kind of hares, the sort of fun-loving militaristic hare in Tammo and the stuffy aristocratic hare in Cornsbury. And so it sets up this interesting tension, can you, have the spirit of a warrior and still be a likable person, or is the only way to be a warrior to be this stuffy old British aristocrat? Unfortunately, Cornsbury and his wife, Mem Davina, disappear after pretty much the first couple chapters of the book, and I guess they appear again in the epilogue. But in a lot of other, if a lot of other storytellers were handling this material, they might bring back Cornsbury in the middle, and you would think Tammo was developing as a warrior, and then Cornsbury would show how Tammo never really learned anything. But that's the problem with a lot of these Brian Jacques books, and I feel like this one in particular. Rather than giving Tammo an arc throughout the story, he gives Tammo an arc at the very beginning of the story, and then he kind of just abandons it. So Tammo had the potential to be a great protagonist. For once we saw a character in the Redwall universe with a family. So often these characters, they don't have parents, but they aren't orphans for some reason. They're just randomly there without a family. So Tammo was adding these new dimensions to the world, this idea of father-son tension that we haven't really seen in a long time since, Matameo, or I guess father-daughter tension in Salamandastron. But instead, Brian Jacques just allows Tammo to become generic. He almost forgets that this book is about Tammo and to give him any kind of voice whatsoever. I feel like this book makes the same mistake as Matameo and the Bellmaker, two of the weaker books I've read so far, and that Brian Jacques just becomes obsessed with populating the universe with lots of different characters that he forgets about the importance of giving them all personalities, especially his protagonist. So, yes, on the one hand, Brian Jacques corrected and nuanced a pattern that had developed earlier in the series of having all the hares be the same. Tammo does not feel particularly like Klecki and Basil. On the other hand, I would much rather have had another Basil clone than have the relatively boring protagonist, who is Tammo. Another way this book starts excellently is in its description of its villain. So Damog Warfang is a giant rat, and he's part of an army, which is also sort of its own society called the Rapscallions. Now, a little side note, I really don't know why Brian Jacques named them the Rapscallions. I mean, maybe it's slightly different to British ears. I don't think so. But I always thought rapscallions sounded more like rascals. It doesn't sound like genuinely terrifying people. So I don't know. Is this Brian Jacques repeating the trope from Outcast of Redwall, where all evil, from innocent mischief to outright violence, is equated in the Redwall universe? That being a rapscallion is no different than being a mass murderer. Anyway, just an interesting choice here. But anyway, this book begins with Damog Warfang and the Rapscallion army/society. Damog's father, Gomad Chun, is dying, and Damog and his brother Byrol have to fight to the death in a ritualistic battle in order to determine which one of them will succeed their father. We also learn that the leader of the Rapscallions gets to carry this cool sword, which is wavy on one side and straight on one side, representing a strategy by land or a strategy by sea. Now, at the beginning of the book, we get an interesting dynamic between Damog and his sidekick, Lugworm the Stoat. So Lugworm is actually responsible for Damog's ascent to get to be the main villain, the leader of the Rapscallions. Lugworm basically helps Damog rig the fight so that Byrol doesn't have a chance. But immediately after that, surprise, surprise, Damog is a pretty cruel master, and he begins to threaten Lugworm, and Lugworm feels stuck. He's done all this stuff to help Damog, and, Damog is constantly threatening him with death. So for the first third of this book, the tension between Lugworm and Damog feels compelling. It pits Damog's sheer aura of intimidation, his bullying traits, against Lugworm's actual competence. And subsequently, Lugworm finds himself in a bad situation where he overhears a pair of Damog's soldiers, Borum and Vendace, or Vendace, I don't know if you pronounce it Italian, basically planning treason against Damog. And the two conspirators basically threaten Lugworm into joining their conspiracy. And so poor Lugworm finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. And when Damog ends up catching him and Borum and Vendace, their lives are spared, but they are basically made to walk in chains the whole time. So at this point, I'm thinking, wow, Brian Jacques is really giving Lugworm this cool kind of arc here. He tries to manipulate himself to power by giving one of the villains some key strategy, and then he's forced against his will to betray his boss, and then his boss can't understand this, so his boss makes him walk humiliated in chains. Like, what's going on here? What are we going to get with Lugworm? I wondered, is his story going to be similar to Ashlegs from Mossflower, and he gradually realizes it doesn't pay off to be a villain sidekick and he runs away? Or is he going to die defending his less competent boss to the death, much like Nightshade did in Outcast of Redwall? But the answer is neither. Lugworm is just kind of randomly killed off a few pages later by Borum. I know I said earlier that Brian Jacques has pleasantly surprised me multiple times when he corrects the problems in his older books, but in this case, it feels like there's one problem that he just really isn't aware of. So in Pearls of Lutra, Brian had this generic secondary villain who serves no real point in the plot, Risconza, kill off a potentially interesting villain in Barranca. Similarly, in this book, we have Vendace and Borum, who are basically the Risconza equivalents, kill off Lugworm, the interesting secondary villain. And what makes this even worse is at least Risconza stays around as the secondary villain in Pearls of Lutra, but Borum and Vendace are killed off pretty soon after Borum kills Lugworm. So it really feels like Lugworm is killed for no reason. You know, he dies a pointless death at the hand of pointless minor villains. So what the heck is going on here, Brian Jacques? Well, we all know that Brian Jacques likes to write in morally simplistic terms and tell stories that are kind of harsh on the villains because he thinks that's what children want. But one way in which this manifests in him that really doesn't work for me, it means that he doesn't even bother to tell the difference between his villains. He can't tell the difference between the ones with interesting stories and the ones that are just generic. I will say that Brian Jacques does admittedly give us permission to sympathize with a pair of his villains in this book, the comedic duo named Sneezewort and Lousewort. You know, I don't think we've ever seen villains before with matching names like that. But again, because this book is so populated with characters, we don't get to know those two so well. I feel like I wish he had picked one, you know, Lugworm or Sneezewort and Lousewort, and made one of those two stories, you know, play out throughout the whole book. Because all I feel is, damn, Lugworm was a three-dimensional character who made this real story really interesting, and Brian just gave up on him for no good reason whatsoever. Now to talk about some good things. One potentially interesting experiment Brian Jacques makes with this book is the degree to which it is and isn't a sequel. So I'd observed in my last video that Brian Jacques clearly doesn't like writing sequels. He likes writing books as blank slates, but quite possibly his publishers were like, you know, the readers actually like sequels. So he started doing this thing with Outcast of Redwall and Pearls of Lutra, where he would write a book that I would call a tangential sequel, in the sense that it maybe carries over one character from a previous book, but it's so many years later that that character is much older. So it can technically be a sequel, but it's also largely in a new age. What's interesting about The Long Patrol is that while it's not a true sequel like Matameo or The Bellmaker, which absolutely continue the stories of old characters, it's also far more of a sequel than Pearls of Lutra or Outcast of Redwall. So in this case, Brian Jacques introduces us to fresh characters in the main plot, but he does include a sequel in the B plot. Namely, he brings back a lot of the young characters from Pearls of Lutra. This includes Tansy, the hedgehog abbess, Cracklin, the recorder squirrel, Viola, the apothecary bankful, Diggum and Gerbil the moles, and of course Arvin, who was the troublesome baby in Pearls of Lutra, and now is the Redwall Abbey warrior. So Brian Jacques, unfortunately, is not great at describing age, and Cracklin oversimplistically refers to herself as old, but I think you're really supposed to interpret her and Tansy and Viola as more like middle age. And even if Brian Jacques doesn't explicitly say it, it's nice to get the nuance of having characters who are years ahead of where they were before, but still aren't just like wise mystical elders. You know, they're young enough to be out there having fun and going on their own adventures. So at first, I really liked this idea of making the book a partial sequel to Pearls. I liked the way Brian Jacques developed Viola Bankful, that she's sort of grown up and, you know, found herself a talent as an apothecary, but she's still kind of difficult to get along with, and Tansy and Cracklin still kind of gossip around her, about her behind her back, you know, as if they're still teenage rivals. I also like that Tansy, for the second book in a row, she doesn't get the classic Redwall quest, but instead has to solve a mystery at the Redwall Abbey. We get not one, but two Tansy mysteries. Let's call her Tansy Drew. I also like that there aren't really descriptions of Arvin, you know, the former troublesome child who used to pretend that he was a warrior, you know, actually participating in battle. Like, yes, implicitly he does fight in the battle against Yamag Warfang at the end of the book, but we don't get much description of Arvin fighting. You know, I kind of like that for most of this book, Arvin's role as Abbey warrior was more theoretical. Like, the idea of it was not, you know, he grew up to be a great soldier and everyone admired him. No, it's more like he was part of the Abbey community. His favorite game as a baby was playing warrior games, and now he got to grow up and learn that skill. Arvin feels less like a sort of badass warrior character like Martin or Matthias before him, and more just like this member of the community who still has a bit of his child self. Unfortunately, I don't feel like the B plot entirely paid out in the end. Again, just because I don't think enough time was given to it. Brian Jacques again makes the mistake of having too many characters in too many places rather than, having fewer plots and writing them well. But I at least appreciated the effort and the compromise of making this book sort of a blank slate, sort of a sequel. And the premise for the Tansy part of the story is that one of Redwall's walls seems to be collapsing, and Tansy and her friends have to solve the mystery of what's causing this. For a moment, I wondered whether Brian Jacques was once again considering doing something more radical with this book. In Pearls of Lutra, he emphatically suggested the idea that time does not stand still in the Redwall universe, that there is a move towards the future, and therefore St. Ninian's church was burned down. And I wondered if he was doing that again and in a darker way in The Long Patrol by suggesting that even an institution as great as Redwall Abbey is going to begin to weather with the passing of time, that even Redwall is not immortal. Of course, Brian Jacques didn't end up going there, and one wonders if he ever really entertained the idea, but it's an interesting thought for a moment. So some other notes on this book. For the second book in a row, we see a character who is just called Skipper. So Skipper is the title of the leader of the Otters, and the first and most prominent Skipper appeared way back in book 2 of the series called Mossflower, which is set at the time of the founding of Redwall. So it feels like in later books, by introducing other otter leaders and not giving them names other than Skipper, Brian Jacques kind of allows his popular character from the past to reappear throughout the series, even though the sort of rules of time in the series mean it can't technically be that Skipper. Now, that said, am I the biggest fan of the two Skippers we saw in the last 2 books? Not really. Because one thing that keeps frustrating me in this series is how Brian Jacques will create these sort of hyper-competent warrior characters who, for some reason, aren't the hero of the story. Like, it doesn't work to imply that your hero, whether it's Tammo or Matthias or Martin, is this special savior character when it feels like every single otter who just exists in the universe is equally unbeatable in battle. There has to be something special about your protagonist, Brian. Finally, this book also introduces 2 badgers, an orphan baby named Rossano and the glass ceiling shattering Salamandrostron ruler, Lady Crega Roseeyes. Crega is a great character. Again, I just wish she was used more consistently throughout the book. So one thing I feel like Brian Jacques should have done is, for some reason, he had 2 different branches of the Long Patrol in different places. I feel like he just sort of had one and had Tammo interact with and train and come into conflict with Crega Roseeyes. That way he could have developed both of those character more. Rossano, meanwhile, another compelling character. He's just a baby, so I can't really fault Brian Jacques for not developing him. There's only so much he can do. Apparently he can say one word, which is nut. And then he does some good stuff with Rossano in the epilogue. And Rossano goes on to make a couple other cameos in the series, but it feels kind of weird that Brian Jacques sort of builds up Rossano so much in this book, but never gives Rossano his own book. So overall, I guess this was just a book that really missed opportunities. One thing people might look for in a book about hares is a book that's very silly, and this book didn't feel very silly. Yet at the same time, if he was trying to write about different kinds of hares, as I suggested, I don't think he capitalized on that either, because he basically just wrote so many hares that we didn't really get to know any of them, including the protagonist. There are so many of these characters who I like, but I just wanted more from. Viola Bankful, Lady Crega Roseeyes. 2 characters I did not want more of as Borum and Vendace. I want them out of this darn book completely, and I wanted more of Lugworm. Lugworm is my favorite character in this book, and Brian, you broke my flippin' heart. Farewell, my sweet vermin prince. R.I.P. Lugworm. You deserved a much better story. But looking forward to coming out with a review of Moral Fox sometime in the future as I continue this rereading project, and I will see you next time.